It's Tuesday, the 15th of November, and this is Politics Live. With me on the programme today, the Conservative MP Danny Kruger, Liberal Democrat MP and former party leader Tim Farron, Zoe Strimple from the Sunday Telegraph and Polly Toynbee of The Guardian. Today, could our council tax bills go up next year? Jeremy Hunt says taxes will have to rise for everyone. We'll be asking this Conservative council leader if local bills are going to have to go up.
I have found myself torn between living as a faithful Christian and serving as a political leader.
Tim Farron found it hard to be a Christian and a frontline politician. So do politics and religion mix? And striding on the global stage, is Britain back?
Our international reputation took a bit of a knock as a result of some of the things that happened more recently.
Well, we just heard the Prime Minister there speaking at the G20 meeting of world leaders in Bali. He's been talking to our political editor, Chris Mason, who asked him how tarnished the UK's reputation had become by the events of this year.
Obviously, our international reputation took a bit of a knock as a result of some of the things that happened more recently. But what I've seen here at the G20 summit in Indonesia is an enormous amount of goodwill for the UK to be an active and engaged member of the international community. There's widespread support for what we've done in Ukraine, where I think Boris Johnson originally has shown incredible leadership that I plan on continuing, and across the board, whether it's on COP and climate change, or indeed how to fix the global economy, stand up to aggression everywhere, support vulnerable countries with food. These are all issues where we can play a role, and people are looking for us to do that.
So has Rishi Sunak restored the UK's reputation, Danny?
Well, I think he's on course to do so. Obviously, he's right. We did take a knock. There's some significant political turbulence that we've just been through, somewhat self-inflicted by the Conservative Party, but in response to very significant global economic events. And what has happened, and it's a testament to our parliamentary system, is that we've corrected those problems. And, you know, the challenge now, it's not simply a case of changing the leadership. We have to set a course back towards stability, and I think he's set us on that course. And time will tell whether both the public, the markets and international opinion agrees with us, but I think he's made a very good start.
A good start, Tim.
Well, I mean, arguably he's behaved more in a grown-up way than his two predecessors, but that's not saying a right lot. I think the United Kingdom has severed its links with many important allies, and being outside the European Union is a challenge for us when it comes to being relevant and having a place at the top table. And I think the UK's decisions have been seen as peculiar by many of our allies beyond Europe as well. The important thing is to keep talking, because if we believe in our values, we need to live them internationally, and that's not just good for our well-being and our economy at home. It's important for our influence and for dealing with human rights abuses and indeed the appalling behaviour of Russia and others overseas.
OK, Zoe, do you think the Prime Minister has made progress?
Well, I mean, it couldn't be kind of worse than it was. So I think in that sense, he's made progress. No, I think he feels like a safe pair of hands. I think for me, what's interesting is that he's been so untested in terms of what he really thinks and what he will do about foreign policy and his attitude to, firstly, Britain's sort of place in the world, but also what he thinks of, for instance, China, where this morning we find that perhaps maybe he's a little bit softer on China than I would personally have liked to see. Maybe he's too soft on percentage of spending on defence. That also concerns me. So I think that's the area that we have no idea what he's going to be like. And he seems to me like he's been doing quite well on the other stuff. He's obviously had a few personnel issues, which...
Okay. Yeah. Polly, personnel issues.
Yes. Well, it's been a long slide. If you think of the long period of austerity that we went through, we slid down the rankings. We were slowest out of the effects of the crash of 2008. behind other comparable countries. Then we had Brexit, which was a disaster in terms of our position on the global stage. I mean, people were appalled and aghast in America, across Europe and everywhere else. What are you doing to yourself? And now we've had then we had Boris Johnson, international joke, and then Liz Truss, who was, sort of extreme and fanatic and determined to push her view through and crashed the economy and left us at least about 35 billion out of pocket just in the short time that she was Prime Minister. So back, I don't know, we'll see, we'll learn a lot on Thursday, whether they mean real repair or just a bit of sticking plaster.
Danny, do you want to respond to that? Because essentially Polly's saying it's not just Liz Truss, it's all the stuff that came before that.
Well, it took a long time to recover the public finances after 2010 when we inherited this terrible budget deficit, but we ended the decade in a very good state financially, and we actually responded very well to the economic shocks of recent years. We have an immediate crisis. It's a global crisis. We're not the only ones with very high inflation. The challenge now, as I say, is to put back a balanced budget, or a path to a balanced budget that will reduce our dependence on an economic model that long predates our time in government. We've got a 30-year...
OK, but what about the points that Polly was making there about Brexit, about Boris Johnson? You were a huge supporter of his, almost right to the end. What about those points?
Well, I mean, it's been very difficult.
Falling behind the others. Yes, these terrible things have happened across the world, but why are we keep falling behind all similar countries?
Well, it depends how you measure it, Polly, and you will obviously find statistics that demonstrate that point. Actually, we're in a very good state comparison. I mean, Germany has higher inflation than us. Italy has higher inflation. We can trade the comparison, and actually, my belief remains that Brexit has put us in a position to be a more nimble and flexible, independent country in the challenges of the 21st century. There are obviously extreme frictions and ructions going on at the moment to do with global economics, to do with what's going on in foreign policy. I don't accept what Tim said, that we have somehow lost our convening power. We saw that over COP, we see it over Ukraine. The UK remains an absolute leader, particularly on global defence and security. This is our rightful position in the UK. We don't need to be part of the European Union to fulfil that role.
Okay. I would say it's reduced our position. I mean, I think it's important not to use catastrophic extreme language. The reality is that we still have a place on the world stage, as you can see. It's just not as good as it was, and our access isn't as good as it was. We behaved in an emotional rather than a logical way over the last few years. Likewise, the economic state. You cannot blame everything on the current Conservative government, but you can blame about £60 billion worth of it on the actions since the summer. And so to a large degree, the very difficult decisions Jeremy Hunt may feel he is forced to make later in the week are a consequence of very stupid decisions made by the Conservatives just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, OK, we're going to stick with those difficult decisions which we're expecting on Thursday from the Chancellor. And let's have a look at a couple of headlines from this morning. I think we're going to start with The Guardian. Tory councils warned Sunak on stark risk of bankruptcy. And then we also have The Telegraph, I think, coming up, do we? Yes, households face steep increase in council tax. Well, to help us discuss this, we are joined now by Tim Oliver from the County Council Network, and he's also, incidentally, the leader of Surrey County Council. Welcome to the programme, Tim. Thank you very much for joining us. Could I start by getting you to put into some kind of context the kind of pressure that councils like yours are under?
Indeed. I mean, all councils, and certainly the county councils, are facing an unprecedented challenge in terms of the impact of inflation and the increase in the demand in the services. So, first and foremost, we're calling on the government to deliver on its pledge, I think, which is to protect those that are the most vulnerable in our society, and to put new money, additional money, into local government. At the moment, we're facing across the system a 3.5 billion shortfall in terms of funding next year. A large part of that is to do with adult social care, but also other pressures. So, it's simply not possible for us to balance our budgets with the funding that we're currently receiving.
So what does that actually mean practically for the services that you offer to people? Because for many people, it's actually the services that are run by local councils are actually the ones where they interact with the state. That's their main interaction with government.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, broadly, 2/3 of most county councils' budgets is spent on delivering social care, whether that's to adults or to families and children with additional needs. And then the rest of it is on the most visible service, actually, which many people see around highways and libraries and so on. So, you know, the reality is that without further funding, then we will have to go back to basics. It will be back to delivering the statutory levels that we're obliged to do. And, you know, that will have an impact potentially on bus services, on libraries, on opening hours for community recycling centres and so on. So a very grim picture.
Yeah, and I just wonder, I mean, you say that that's sort of the difficulty, isn't it? That you've got huge restrictions on how you can spend money because, as you say, there are statutory things like children's social services which you have to do. And then on the other side, a limit as well to how you can raise funds.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that is the challenge, the constant challenge. And, you know, over the last 10 years or so, we've seen a steady decrease in central government funding. And we've had to rely upon council tax increases to fill that gap. But I mean, we're in a very different situation this year. You know, a significant part of the challenge is around inflation, and that's not likely to change in any short order. So we do absolutely call on the government to provide additional funding. Absolutely accept this is a very difficult challenge for the Chancellor in terms of balancing his books. But, you know, the government have to prioritise the most vulnerable people in our society. And those are the people that local government look after. OK,
Tim, stick with us. I just want to ask Danny about this. I mean, what do you make of that? I know from speaking to council leaders this week that there is huge concern about this across the country. We've just heard there from Tim, essentially, back to basics if there isn't more help for local authorities.
Well, I mean, I want to echo his points, and I really share his concerns. And on behalf of Wiltshire Council, where my constituency is, you know, we have exactly that challenge. You know, 60% of our spending goes on adult social care. We need to reform that system in order to free up finances for the other discretionary services that, as you say, that's where the cuts fall, because you have to meet the social care obligations. And my regret, and Polly mentions austerity, my regret about the way that the last time we had to balance the books, we cut too deeply, I think, into local government, with the result that a lot of the social fabric that communities depend on fell away. And I hope we don't do that again. So the challenge is to reform social care to free up money, to trust communities more to manage these local services. I think there are reforms that you can make, but fundamentally, yes, the money needs to keep flowing to local government. OK,
Tim Farron, you, of course, were a part of that government. Well, not a part of the government, but a part of, you know, a Liberal Democrat. You were part of that government as Liberal Democrats and oversaw that huge, many years of austerity. Do you regret that now?
First things first, some decisions for sure. First things first, austerity really began in 2008 with the global crash. Not blaming Labour, but it began before us. And the coalition cut $1 billion less than Labour were promising to make in their 2010 manifesto. It's important to, and that was something like 60 billion less than the Conservatives were promising. So that was the impact that we had, was to massively reduce the cuts that would have happened. Having said that, I think the coalition definitely got capital spending cuts wrong in the early years. It was a very foolish thing to have done and has had an impact. And the reality is, so in Cumbria, my communities, between a quarter and a third of all the hospital beds are blocked at the moment, and they're blocked because the care system is on its knees, and the county council will do everything it can and is doing everything it can to fill that gap, but you can't do that if there's no workforce, and there's no workforce for reasons to do with us leaving the European Union, but actually principally because of the evaporation of the local housing stock into Airbnb. So these things need fixing, and some of them are not cheap, and some of them are actually quite cheap. If you fix the law to make sure you protect local housing for local people, there'll be homes for care workers to live in. But the knock-on through the rest of the health service is colossal. So the lack of social care is not just crippling and awful for the families affected directly, but just the impact on the hospitals means that A&E's clogged up, means that your ambulance takes 2 hours to drop off a patient, means that waiting times are dangerously long. So the one thing the government must fix is social care.
OK, and Polly, you were wanting to come in.
I mean, I would agree absolutely about that. Social care is the answer. It's the answer to the NHS. It's why the NHS is just stuck, because, you know, a third of its beds in lots of places are blocked. And, you know, it's not just that, it's that there are now hundreds of thousands more each year people not getting any social care at all who would have got it. And there are lots of children too now not getting the statutory social services that they need, ending up in care when they could have been protected beforehand. The numbers of children in care is soaring because of lack of care. So these council leaders are absolutely right. These are Tory council leaders. You know, in Hampshire and in Kent, you're saying Wiltshire, Surrey, they should have made much more fuss much sooner. They should have been marching on Downing Street and resigning from the party. I mean, if they together said, right, we're going to go independent, they could threaten the government quite seriously.
And with social care, so obviously social care is one of the most visible things, high-profile things that local government does, alongside schools. The majority of schools in my patch, or certainly the ones I've spoken to, which is a very good chunk of them, are planning to make, well, what were currently unplanned job losses this year because of the state of their budgets. Now, if education and social care are the two shop window issues that local government looks after, what do you think happens to planning? What do you think happens to refuse collection? All the stuff that is deemed to be a little less glamorous, a little less shop window, they are cut to the bone. And the consequences are, so again, with no planning department, you've got no one to enforce local occupancy. So the problem I talked about earlier on about there being no homes for local people to work in our care and hospitality sectors in the lakes, that gets even worse. So local government is in real crisis.
And I do echo that, and it's absolutely the reality. But as Tim said, the fundamental problem we have here is inflation. I mean, there's been a significant investment in local government, and not enough that we'd all like to see more, but 5% more this year has gone into local government from central government. But inflation is more than that. So the great challenge that every bit of the public sector has, like every one of us has, is rising prices and the costs of employment, the costs of services, the costs of things that councils have to buy. So the great challenge is to get on top of inflation. And the answer to that is not just ever more public spending. It's a great economic challenge that we have as a country. And then what local government fundamentally needs is inflation to come down, which is an economic challenge that goes beyond whatever the funding settlement might be.
Zoe.
I mean, I would just echo what Danny's saying, to think more broadly maybe about what the economic challenges are for a kind of long-term positive shift up, rather than kind of there's always a problem of trying to take massively limited state resources and shift it around and make it stretch over ever-growing demand. So actually, you know, something that kind of is dynamic, that allows, as you say, inflation to go down and for innovation to spring up, and then more money is generated from the market end of things, perhaps. I mean, I'm not an economist, so I'm going to leave it there, but I sort of...
Yeah, OK. Well, Tim Oliver from the County Council Network is still with us. I just wanted to move on now and talk a little bit. I mean, we've heard lots of rumours ahead of Thursday, but one of the things being kind of briefed around Westminster is the idea that the cap on council tax could be raised to 5%. Just wanted to get your reaction to that, Tim. Is it anywhere near enough? Will it help you?
Well, it won't be enough in terms of filling the funding gap. Actually, to do that, we'd have to increase, every single council would have to increase their council tax by 9% to fill the gap. So 5% wouldn't actually achieve that aim. You know, at the end of the day, we have asked for flexibility as local government around the council tax limits, but that's really to enable us to use some of that money to top up local services, not to replace proper funding from central government. So it is, and certainly now where all of our residents are facing significant cost of living challenges, now is not the time to be increasing their council tax by 5%. So my request continues to be to government: give us the proper funding for social care. You know, one of the key areas that we need to address with the health system is around the discharging from hospital. You know, your panel's talked about bed blocking. Actually, of course, social care is not just about people going into residential care. It's also about, you know, a significant number of high-cost packages are working age adults with learning disabilities. So, you know, council tax has its place to play in all of this, but it is not raising it to 5%.
Tim, in Surrey, even if you have the flexibility, then you're saying you would try and hold council tax where it is?
We always, we're going through the budget process at the moment. We always focus on keeping the council tax increases to the minimum that we can possibly afford. Absolutely.
OK. And I suppose one thing is, though, you know, and this will be felt in some parts of the world perhaps more than Surrey, is that it is a very regressive tax as well. So if it were to go up, it puts more pressure on the poorest people that you are working for.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, you know, there's a significant difference in what councils can raise from their council tax base, but it is affecting those with less means. So it is not a good tax in that sense, and it's, you know, so I think most council leaders are very reluctant to continually increase council tax levels.
And Danny, there is an issue as well, isn't there, around, you know, Surrey would be, relatively speaking, a more well-off local authority. But for some local authorities, some of the big unitaries in the Midlands and the North, they have a much smaller tax base. They have people paying lower council tax. They have fewer people paying business rates. So it's also much more difficult for those.
Right, yeah. So the ideal model is that we raise more tax locally. We have a very centralised system in the UK, I think the most centralised in the developed world. Most money spent locally is raised centrally and redistributed to councils. That's wrong in principle, but as you say, you have to have a redistribution mechanism so that places which have a smaller tax base that are poorer do get money redistributed from the richer areas, and we need that. But fundamentally what we need is those areas to grow their tax base, to grow their prosperity, to ensure that people are less reliant on government services in the first place. And as Zoe says, that's about having a dynamic economy. And levelling up is the whole mission, domestic mission of this government, to ensure that we get this incredibly unequal geographic economy we have fixed.
Is that physically possible, given the constraints we're talking about and given those difficult decisions which we are expecting to have to be made on Thursday?
Well, the immediate challenge, and to get through this winter, is to settle the markets, to restore our reputation for fiscal discipline, and to resume a trajectory towards growth. But that growth has got to be an inclusive one, and one that is spread properly across the country. It's not just about turbocharging the South East again and growing our financial sector so that we can redistribute spending to other areas. We need to grow the whole economy of the UK, and that's the great mission of this government.
I mean, I'll give you a freebie from our neck of the woods. I mean, for the lakes and the dales and other rural parts of the country, particularly which are regular tourist and holiday destinations, maybe a fifth to a quarter of all our housing stock is not lived in, owned by second homeowners and or holiday lets, and therefore nowhere for the workforce to live. We changed planning law to protect permanent dwellings, to keep them as permanent dwellings. For no cost to the government whatsoever, you could solve the workforce problem we just talked about in social care and with hospitality and tourism. But the slide into people earning or owning multiple homes where many people haven't even got one is not just morally bankrupt, it's also massively destabilising to our economy, particularly in communities like mine.
Yes, and in Devon and Cornwall and other parts of the country as well. OK, thank you very much to Tim Oliver from the County Council Network. Thanks for joining us. We are going to move on now and talk about one of those, well, two of the topics that you're not supposed to talk about at dinner parties, religion and politics, the two important ones. Tim Farron, you've recently written a book. I read a couple of chapters last night. Thank you very much. I was on an Avanti West Coast train, so you know,
had plenty of time.
Had a long time, yeah. It's called A Mucky Business, Why Christians Should Get Involved in Politics. So why did you write this book?
Well, the story of A Mucky Business comes from me being a Christian Union house party, which is just as exciting as you might imagine, when I was 18, and a guy saying to me, "Why are you involved in politics, Tim? It's a mucky business." I gave him a terrible answer at the time, but I've thought about it a lot more, and in recent times I think that it's a kind of niche book in the sense that it is written for Christians, but we're very delighted for people to look over our shoulders and read it too. My sense is that Christians, it's not so much I want them to put a rosette on and stand for Parliament, but I'm concerned that they pay too little attention to politics, partly because they feel that they don't trust the sources of the news that are out there. They may feel that politics is grubby and mucky and therefore we should keep out of it. But my view that Christians shouldn't panic about the state of the world, because we kind of know how it all ends, but at the same time we ought not to be disengaged. We should care, and care deeply about loving your neighbour. Means the people who have not been born yet, so you should care about climate change. It means people who arrive here on dinghies. It means people you may not know but may not even like. And so trying to get people to care about politics and form an opinion in an informed way, particularly seeing what's happening in the States, so many people who would call themselves Christians there, susceptible to fake news. So the book is really saying to people, look, care about politics, be informed about politics, and then, you know, join whichever party or vote whichever party you like, but do so from an informed background.
But, I mean, given when you resigned in 2017, and the quote at the time was you were torn between living as a faithful Christian and serving as a political leader. I mean, that sounds like there is an inherent problem there.
I think there's a Tim Farron lack of wisdom problem there. I think a wiser person could easily have navigated the situation better than me.
So what would you have done differently?
Well, no, I think that the challenge is really, I mean, my situation was that I was leader of a small party, a moment a day of news coverage during a general election. People only wanted to talk to me about my faith. You either bat it away by denying it or you get into the weeds with it. So either I'm a rubbish Christian or a rubbish leader, and I thought that's not tolerable, so we'll do neither of those things, shall we? So it is. But I'm certainly of the view that we in the West, and certainly in Britain, find ourselves in a place where there's enormous religious tolerance, and that Christians should not, in politics, complain about being persecuted or marginalised. But we ought to contend for the place of faith in the public square all the same, because I think there's an assumption that the absence of faith is neutral and the having of faith is a kind of eccentricity, and I think that's not right.
Well, perhaps not an eccentricity, but in your particular case, it would seem that your specific evangelical Christian beliefs, your interpretation of the Bible, of Scripture, was at odds with the very socially progressive party that you were leading.
Yeah, not really. I mean, so first of all, if you're a Christian, I'm going to claim that we believe in equality more than anybody else, in the sense of, you go back to the beginning of Genesis, God creates human beings in his own image. So we're not just accidentally, biologically equal. We are equal at an enormous, lofty rate. And that means, so for example, the most awesome thing we've seen through the James Webb Telescope so far is not as important or awesome as you or any single one of us to God. And so that sense of equality and enormous importance and dignity is fundamental to my beliefs and my belief in equality. Obviously, there is an issue. I think people may be in a post-religious age, which to a degree we are in parts of the West, who kind of assume that if there is a God, he's just going to pat them on the back and say, well done all the time. That kind of God, well, Dawkins would be right about that kind of dog. He'd be a delusion, an extension of yourself. If there really is a God, he is going to disturb you. He is going to challenge you. He's going to sometimes offend you in all parts of your life. And so for a Christian in politics, the fundamental thing is to be humble and recognise that you do not have the answer to all things, that you are flawed, you're in need of forgiveness, just as Matt Hancock is apparently seeking it in the jungle, but we're in need of forgiveness, and therefore you're going to treat other people gently and kindly because you realise you're no better than them.
Danny, you are also a committed Christian. Do you find that compatible with your role as a politician?
Well, yes. I mean, Tim is a hero because, as we've seen just now, he's very gentle and decent in his politics, but he's very courageous in his faith, and that's an inspiration to us. I do think he has a problem with his party, which is quite aggressively secular. My party is more tolerant, and I personally find Parliament in general, but also the Conservative Party particularly, completely fine to be a Christian. Most people probably disagree with me on a lot of things, but actually Parliament is a good institution for accommodating the diversity of opinion in this country. I find it easier to be in Parliament than I do on social media or even in the mainstream media.
But do you think that is because the Conservative Party is more at ease with the sort of slightly fudging, Anglican, softer kind of hedging your bets type Christianity than perhaps the kind of strident evangelical?
We have a tradition in our party of accommodating a multitude of different perspectives on life, and I think the Liberal Party and to a certain extent the modern Labour Party are much more dogmatic in their faith, which is an aggressively atheist one, than ours is.
Okay.
I'll simply do a quick line from my perspective. I mean, I think to be a Christian in any part of society, you're always going to be countercultural, and we're told to turn the other cheek, so we haven't to complain about it. I would always say, and I often say it to my own party, remember where we came from. The Liberal Party emerged in the 19th century as a movement basically of nonconformist, basically evangelical Christians who believed that they wanted the same rights as Anglicans, and as a consequence fought for the rights of every other minority as well.
Wouldn't be allowed in your party these days.
Well, I'm not sure, but
that's for another day. Polly, you are Vice President of Humanist UK. How fortunate we have you with us.
Yes.
Well, everybody's entirely entitled to their own belief, and of course the Parliament should be full of people of every sort of belief. The problem comes if in the past particularly, the religious try to impose their particular beliefs on the population. I mean, at the moment, for instance, the the last big liberal issue to be won, in a way, is the right to die. Now, for several decades, the population has been strongly in favour, like 80% in poll after poll, saying if you're in the last months of your life, you should have the right to die with dignity. You should be able to die at the time of your choosing and ask a doctor to put you out of your misery if you're dying anyway. And I've seen my mother die in great pain of cancer, longing to die a bit sooner. And it's been the religious in both houses that have put a block on this against the will of the people. So in that sense, that's where religion becomes a problem. What people's private beliefs are, I mean, Tony Blair, Catholic, he said, we don't do religion. I mean, I think they were right about that. You don't push your religion on anybody else. It's a private matter. It's part of your character. You know, anyone who's voting for Tim knows exactly where he's coming from and what he believes in. That's fine. I mean, I think because we are such a secular country, one of the most secular countries in the Western world, I think most people cringe at it a bit. So whether it's advisable tactically, as I say, you're brave because it's probably people go a bit.
So I think that the point of this isn't that you have a sort of private religion and then politically you're able to function, which is definitely part of it. But it's what can religion do by way of giving leaders a coherent philosophy of life. And that, therefore, means a coherent political philosophy, which is what we so sorely miss. So I, personally, completely secular and atheist, would be interested in having a leader who actually was able to stitch together various different bits of what it is to be a human in a society and at least have a theory of society and humanity and our relationship to each other that wasn't just like opportunistic, changing, sort of entirely economic. I do think that when one's theology trumps one's ability to think clearly about policy in a secular liberal democracy, you do have a problem. But this Yom Kippur, the Jewish New Year, I hardly ever go to synagogue, but I did this time when I read the Jonathan Sachs commentary, and I found it so morally sophisticated in ways that made me think, God, if he was a leader, it would be fantastic, because this was not some sort of crude foisting of religion. I mean, Jews aren't so into that anyway, really, but no offense. But in terms of an impressive, coherent kind of worldview that was sophisticated and morally, intellectually and morally and politically sophisticated, I thought it was incredibly impressive. I suppose my worry is when I think, Tim, although much of what you say, sounds good, and I agree. I think when what you've said in the past, perhaps about religion needing to root people, and so Christianity becomes synonymous with a particular kind of Britishness and a particular kind of local identity. I will always stand up for the sort of rootless global person, actually, because you're not that far then from saying, like, if you don't belong unless you're kind of the soil. So I think as long as you can keep a sort of global, flexible vision and then, really stick up for your moral, coherent universe and show that you can keep things separately, then I think politics and religion absolutely could mix.
Yeah. But his problem came when it came to things like gay marriage, or in American election, we've just seen, abortion playing a really important part, and that's very much because of
the thing you said about
but sometimes people can detach them.
I'll say not a controversial thing, probably not in this audience, but to some people it would be. I think Christian nationalism is a heresy. The idea that you've got to add to your faith, guns and flags and all that kind of thing. I think that's absolutely nonsense and very dangerous. I do think that on the kind of general point that Polly makes, I would disagree, because all of us have a worldview. Now, I think for me to legislate to make people who are not Christians live as though they were, point taken, and as a liberal, I think I've got no right to do that. However, for me to have to leave, so we've all got a worldview one way or another. We may be able to really clearly point to something that has formed it, or it might be a variety of things. But the reality is we have one. And the idea that, so you wouldn't expect a Marxist to leave their values at the door. You wouldn't expect a free marketeer, Milton Friedman disciple, to leave theirs at the door. Why do we expect Christians and Jews and Muslims and Hindus to leave theirs? That's a bizarre thing to request.
Well, I mean, absolutely. And Zoe, you're right that we need to beware of any sort of religion that implies exclusiveness or as you say, some sort of, native rootedness. I mean, the great thing about British nationalism is it's always been civic, as Tim was suggesting. We don't have this sort of blood and soil patriotism here, certainly not one bound up in faith. But that said, all of our politics derives from our classical Christian roots, including liberalism, including secularism. The word secular is a church term for meaning how to manage disputes, property disputes within the church. The state adopted Christian values and has, in a sense, modernised them in good and bad ways. I mean, I think we have a great challenge in this country of how to disagree well when we've lost a common root and a sort of common language of conversation. And I don't agree with Polly that there's an attempt, or even was traditionally an attempt by the religious alone to impose their views. That's what everybody does. Everybody brings their faith to work. Everybody thinks everyone should think like them. We have a democracy in which we get along and we let other people have their say. But we all believe that we have a perspective that other people should adopt. And the secular atheist liberals, I'm afraid to say, are the most dogmatic in this space because they think that they're being neutral. They think that they are being tolerant and believing in diversity. Actually, they are trying to impose a worldview. I think you want to talk about assisted dying. That's a perfect example of it, where I'm afraid you do have a philosophy that is extremely dogmatic about individual choice over what is a far greater set of concerns that we should have, and people on the left should have, Polly, around discrimination, around people with disabilities, about our treatment of the elderly. We really should be having a more sophisticated conversation, but because of the religion of choice and autonomy, people are only saying one thing, which is people should be able to ask the state to kill them when they want it to.
Well, it sounds to be quite reasonable. The thing is, it sounds to most of the population, it's a peculiar perversion of our commons and lords that they have so many people who are religious who've managed to stop what most of the population
but
wants to happen.
It was the campaign in the Lords against the assisted dying bill was led by Professor Elora Finlay, former president of the Royal College of Medicine.
And a Catholic.
No, she has no faith at all.
That's not true.
Well, she has a...
That doesn't stop me being a Catholic.
It's not for me to say what her faith is, but certainly neither she nor I nor any of the people use religious arguments. It's you guys who use religious arguments because you think that this cult of individual choice trumps everything else. There's metaphysical principle. There's a whole lot of practical reasons why assisted dying, even though it's debated time and again in Parliament, when people actually look at the reality of what the law would look like and what it would mean, they realise there are practical objections to doing it, and that's why Parliament keeps saying no.
Absolutely not the case at all. It's a very simple matter. Most other countries, a lot of other countries now have it. We are blocking it. We will get there eventually. I hope before I die we will get
I do think the one thing from apparently the Christian perspective that makes sense in having concerns about assisted dying is the sense of pressure, because I think broadly I agree with Polly, but I have to say, if I were like an old person and I knew I was being a burden and I was now actively choosing not to let me to choose, I do think that, and also there's a sort of anti-old ageism in general. I think.
Well, that's why it's such a dangerous.
People are like, "I'll kill them off because Brexit killed them off." Like they're sapping all the system, get rid of their houses, steal their wealth.
To save the NHS money, we would have assisted dying for everyone who's approaching death because they do cost a lot of money.
That's
and the pressure.
Ridiculous.
I mean, no, it's not
that this is eugenics.
That is well, I'm afraid the
true.
argument in Canada, where I've just visited to look at this, that's exactly what's happening. And what would happen here, which is that the healthcare system, and we've seen it done before in Liverpool, if you recall, the state administrators, health administrators, not out of any ill will, recognise that the cheapest option is to help this person die quicker than
well, the
they would otherwise.
anecdotage is always wonderful. You can pick one case,
one of the
and then the whole thing,
it's
as if an anecdote. It's quite plain now that the doctors too themselves are in favour because there's a see death
Polly,
at its worst and understand that people need to be released from pain if they wish to be. None of us knows whether we choose it or not ourselves, but we all want the choice that when we get there, what can we bear or not.
Why just for people who are dying? Why not for anybody?
Yeah, Polly. I mean, I also went through this situation with my mother, who was obviously in pain and who died far too young from cancer, and I hear constituents and others and the position they come from, which some would share your point of view. So I respect it and I understand it, but I think the consequences of saying yes to assisted dying are far worse than saying no. Because what you do is you create a culture where we expect people to end their lives or have their lives ended. You also see one of the people who's spoken to me who most worried about it is somebody who doesn't have any faith at all, but is an oncologist and thinks that palliative care will be pushed to one side when it comes to funding, because it'll be no longer a case of how do we allow people to die well.
We need to know that people are Christians, because during the whole of this battle, people
like
Nora and Neil and others haven't declared the extent to
I think that's not fair
their
at all.
opposition to it has come from their religious faith, and I do think people should.
So I'm just saying, the lady I cited is not had no faith
at
at all. But actually, would it make the slightest bit of difference if she did? Because we come with our worldviews that we believe. I'm not sent here with a chief whip from upstairs. I believe what I believe. You believe what you believe, and they are of equal value. Mine is no less valuable than you because I happen to believe in a God.
We need to know that when the Pope had everybody in pulpits telling everybody to vote against abortion. We need to know that.
I just want to cuss in here because this is actually something, Danny, this is a live debate within your family. I'll show everyone a headline of the Evening Standard. We can see that there. Prue Leith, for those that don't know, this is Danny's mother, the well-known TV chef, Prue Leith, calls for assisted dying law change after brother's awful death. So this is a very active debate. You and your mum are making a documentary. Very active debate that you're having in your family.
Yes, but we're having it well, I'm glad to say. And it is possible to disagree profoundly on these questions and still be friends. So yeah, my mum has a view, which I think she's pretty much where Polly is. I think a rather 20th century worldview, not recognising the improvements in palliative care that have happened in recent decades and the opportunity we have to have a proper system of support for the dying. Her brother, my uncle, did die terribly, but that's because I'm afraid to say the NHS let him down and too many people suffer awfully at the end of life. We should be putting all of this energy that's currently going into this, I think, very dangerous debate about assisted dying into improving the palliative care system in this country because you do not need to die.
My mother had wonderful palliative care. There are a lot of people who cannot, for whom morphine and morphine-based drugs just don't work. And for those people, they need the choice.
With religion and politics, though, to just go back to the original question, as Christians, do you not think the problem might be that you can't be persuaded out of certain positions because you'll come up against a theological, obstacle? Because I think the idea, if you're not religious, is that technically, and especially if you're in politics, you should be able to be persuaded to any position if you're convinced enough.
Well,
does that apply to you?
I would challenge anybody to imagine that they're so rational and objective that they will shift from their fundamental values. I mean, I happen to share with Tim this belief in our intrinsic value as children of God, but I'm sure you guys, as atheists, also believe in the incredible importance of human life and equality and freedom and all of these values. So I don't think that it's because of where these ideas come from. It's what are our ideas, and the idea that you should have to kind of go around saying, "Don't believe me, I'm a Christian," is absurd. We're inviting you to take on a set of arguments, and I challenge you to be open and to listen to our arguments because we think that the practical reasons against assisted dying are absolutely overwhelming.
No, I mean, so on things like that, I think there's a lot of wisdom that you have. But I think at the end of the day, the technicalities of what you believe as Christians sounds quite almost mad to those of us who don't think that don't believe in the Bible.
Is a choice. So it's not a thing that was imposed upon me.
So you could always go back from it, actually, or adapt it.
If I disagree with it and all the rest of it. But I also think the thing to remember in all this is I don't think, and I hope we're not coming across as this, I don't think we've got a monopoly on morality. I think people who don't believe in God, many of them, I can think about Peter Tatchell, who's one of the bravest, most moral people I could think of. My challenge to him and to others is maybe you're wrong about the source of that morality.
OK, all right. Big day coming up tomorrow, Prime Minister's questions, but as we saw, the Prime Minister is currently in Bali, so Dominic Raab is going to be doing PMQs, and we know he has a few issues going on at the moment. Let's just hear a little bit of Rishi Sunak being asked about that in Bali.
Now, I've been very clear. I don't recognise the characterisation of Dominic's behaviour, and I also was not and am not aware of any formal complaints.
I asked about if there were any informal.
No, well, there's a formal complaints process, and that's the important thing that people should avail themselves of if they have concerns.
Did anyone or any document raise any concerns about his behaviour at all?
I was not and am not aware of any formal complaints about Dominic's behaviour, but I would say if people do have concerns, whether it's about any individual, that they should come forward and talk to people about those.
OK. Danny, does the Conservative Party have a bullying problem? Just last week we were talking about Gavin Williamson, accusations against him bullying people.
My experience is not at all, but, bullying doesn't tend to happen in the open. I find the general culture of our party to be very collegiate and supportive. I'm really sorry, I don't actually know what these accusations against Dom are. Is this the story about him throwing a tomato out of a salad? Is that one we're discussing?
I think there are a number of allegations in relation to the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office has made some accusations.
On the record?
About his behaviour.
On the record?
Yes, on the record.
OK, well, my experience of Dom is extremely professional. And I don't find among our colleagues in general. Westminster's a mucky place, as Tim's our friend once said, and there is all sorts of difficult interpersonal relations, and voices get raised and so on. But no,
I'm afraid,
I don't recognise it.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Jay will be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.